I'm sorry to bother you, man, but your flyer's waiting.
The guilt Inga felt almost every moment of every day still would not ease. It was nearly 5 years now since her daughter, Lou Blake, had been imprisoned on instruction of the Federation's Central Justice Unit by her son, Arlen Joden. At 21 years old, Arlen was the youngest ever security minister of Exbar. Inga's father, Ashton Blake, had dropped the family name decades ago to avoid attention from the Federation. Inga had never married and stuck to the age-old but somewhat less common convention of females being known by their forename. She found herself sticking to traditions even more now that she was president of Exbar, and always had to be seen doing the right things to avoid the same attention from the Federation. Deep inside, she admired her daughter and fought every day with her desire to let her go free. Lou was so headstrong, so certain in her views, and insistent that she alone would, against all tradition and etiquette, be known by her family name, Blake. Inga deeply regretted allowing her daughter to read Rog Blake's electronic journals. The journals had been kept by her father, Ashton, who was Rog Blake's uncle. Ashton had always been proud of Rog, and Inga often felt he had shown more admiration for Rog's exploits than her own accomplishments. She suspected this had fueled her daughter's obsession with her cousin's story and her disgust at the injustice throughout, the tyranny. Rog had died a convicted child molester and terrorist, his name despised throughout the galaxy. This drove Blake's deep-seated desire to restore Rog's reputation and to continue his mission to bring down the tyrannical Federation. It was over 10 years ago now that Lou Blake had originally left Exbar to put together a small band of freedom fighters and political activists, their intent being to persuade non-aligned planets to remain outside the Federation and join with them to try and stop the Federation's Pylene-assisted pacification program. When she returned to Exbar, Blake was imprisoned. Her political activities were reported widely as acts of terrorism by the Federation, her name attached to her disgraced cousins for maximum impact.
Mom.
The Central Justice Unit framed and convicted Blake for the murder of 2,000 innocent people during a falsified civil war on the outlying planet of Garnos, and she was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in captivity on Exbar, to be held by her half-brother's security forces. Joden showed no compassion and no regret in undertaking her imprisonment. The strain of trying to keep Exbar in an arm's-length but diplomatically agreeable relationship with the Federation was constant for Inga. Politics between Exbar and the Federation had always been complicated due to Exbar's proud history of independence, and as the Federation continued to expand, these relations became even more fraught. Even though Inga was president, it seemed increasingly that the communications with the Federation were now being made through Joden. This made Inga anxious. She knew Joden was politically ambitious, and the gulf between their views seemed to widen almost daily. Saddened by the fact that she was suspicious of her own son, her family became more fragmented than ever, and this exacerbated the feeling that she had failed as a mother.
I'll be right here, Mom.
In her cell, Blake paced, counting the white ceiling tiles with deliberation. Today it was the tiles, other days it was the lines on the grey carpeted floor, anything to keep her mind from thinking too hard about where she was or how she got here. As prisons went, hers was not unpleasant. A large, comfortable bed, private bathroom, a small recreation area she seldom used, with a window overlooking the exercise yard. There was also a small alcove just out of view of the surveillance cameras. Her relatively luxurious surroundings were due to the influence of her mother, she was sure. For being a prisoner of the Federation, Blake gave her brother sole credit. Just thinking about him and his betrayal of her made Blake's naturally pretty face harden and briefly look older than her 32 years. She ran her hands through her thick, wavy hair, which was brown with hints of auburn, focusing herself by scraping it back into a ponytail secured with a tie pulled from a pocket in her green prisoner-issue jumpsuit. Then she returned to pacing and counting tiles. Getting angry wasn't going to do her any good. The large grey door to the cell slid open, emitting Inga, who wore a flowing green velvet dress that tapered in at the waist to complement her slim figure. Although in her mid-50s, she carried her age exceptionally well, her skin almost blemish-free, and the same piercing brown eyes that Blake had inherited. Blake noticed the faintly worried expression on Inga's otherwise serene face, but then again she realized she couldn't remember a time when Inga wasn't worried. Through the long years of trying to survive, turning Exbar from a desolate Federation outpost into a civilized planet of farms and small but prosperous towns, the progress made during Inga's rise as a respected political leader and now president was hard-won. The elder woman paused and then entered the room, looking at the face of her pretty daughter, and still seeing the young, adventurous child she loved, with her sprinkling of freckles that softened her looks. After some small talk, Inga motioned Blake, and they walked over to the alcove. Blake began to wonder why her mother had moved her to the only part of the room invisible to the security cameras.
Mother? What's the matter? Why are we huddled over here?
I have a message for you.
Inga's voice faded slightly, as if she wasn't quite sure of what she was about to say.
Really? And who, Mother, would be moved to contact a convicted terrorist on a backwater rock like Exbar?
Inga winced at the bitter edge to her daughter's voice, even more convinced now that she needed to share this message.
It was from Aurak.
For once in her life, Blake was stunned into an uncharacteristic silence, momentarily.
Aurak? You mean the Aurak? The brilliant machine that Raj and his crew possess and that no one has seen or heard of for 30 years? That is probably in some Federation vault or in bits on Gouda Prime, if it ever really existed at all. Aurak, the myth, just decided to send me a quick hello.
Inga allowed herself a moment's inward amusement at her daughter's normally confident and unshakable demeanour being visibly stunned, before she recited a hurried and breathless description of the message's arrival.
Came over a channel, one that no one uses or knows about. There should be no way to break into it, and the message signature and encoding is like nothing the Federation, or anyone else for that matter, ever uses.
Inga hesitated for a moment, knowing that if she told Blake the message's content, she was setting her daughter on a dangerous course, from which there would be no turning back. A destiny that she had been trying to protect Blake from her whole life.
It was brief, only a few lines, and it said danger. Discovery by Federation imminent. Rescue required. Lou Blake's presence required immediately. Clearance will be provided through the blockade.
Inga exhaled shakily. Now she had done it, and where her daughter went with it was now up to her.
That's lovely, Mother. But what exactly am I supposed to do with this information? Aurak can issue all the invitations it likes, but I'm not exactly free to come and go as I please, am I?
I can make it happen if that's truly what you want.
Why would you do that? You've always regretted that I found out about him, and hated that I was drawn into his ideals.
I didn't want you to find out about him, but on some level I always knew you would. And I know that no matter what I did, you're like him. I see it more in you every day. You don't look like him, not really, but you're just like him in all the ways that really matter. And it's not something I can fight or shield you from any longer. You're my Lou, my kind, energetic, passionate, headstrong daughter. It's been killing me to keep you here, but I can't keep you locked up forever just to protect you.
Noticing tears in her mother's eyes, Blake could feel tears starting to well up in her own, and blinked them away furiously. She turned to stare at her mother, a little shocked. She was finally beginning to realize that Inga, whom she loved dearly, did understand her, after all. Blake suddenly thought that her mother might be more than just the constantly worried parental figure she always felt tried to stifle her.
Mother, Jodan would never allow it.
Jodan is not president. I am.
Inga spoke sternly, and for a moment Blake saw an expression on her mother's face that looked like her own when she was refusing to back down from a fight. It was a look that would have reminded her of another face, had she ever had the chance to meet her cousin, Rog Blake. Once Inga had made up her mind, things moved surprisingly quickly. Within a few days, the use of a small ship had been cleared, as had the recruitment of 2 crew, consisting of a pilot and an engineer that Inga trusted implicitly. The ship had been registered in the official logs as taking a cargo of power cells to Gouda Prime, something that was not unusual in trade deals between Exbar and GP. The crew had needed some persuading regarding the blockade, understandably, and Inga had assured them that they had the necessary codes from a reliable source. The only cargo that was left unregistered was that of Blake herself. A few hours before dawn, Blake stood in front of the mirror in her cell. Seeing herself in something other than a prison uniform for the first time in 6 years was curiously liberating. Black pants and leather boots that were low-heeled, along with a thick, loose-fitting blue shirt belted at the waist. Blake smiled briefly, just happy that she didn't look like a prisoner anymore. She turned away with a shake of her ponytail, her characteristic disinterest in her appearance returning as she refocused on more important matters. The door to her cell opened and Inga came in, followed by 2 guards. She was smiling, but Blake saw the extra lines in the corner of her mother's eyes, a telltale sign that Inga was not as calm as she appeared.
Ready, darling?
I've been ready years, Mother.
Blake winced a little at the edge she couldn't keep out of her voice. As they walked through the quiet, grey corridors of the prison block, towards the outer doors, no one spoke, partly to avoid attracting attention, but in truth, neither mother nor daughter was sure what to say in their final moments together. The guards jumped in the front seats of a 4-seater, roofless buggy with Inga and Blake squeezed into the back, and they headed out of the hangar doors of the prison complex. Blake took in a huge lung full of fresh air she had not breathed for over 6 years, and couldn't help but smile widely. On the brief drive to the airstrip where the ship awaited, Inga went over the final details Blake would need to leave Exbar's airspace without attracting unwanted attention.
Lou, the 2 crew are the most loyal to me that I know. They are good men, sworn to secrecy, and they won't say much to you on my instruction. The less they know, the better for them, but they have to return to Exbar to their families. So once you get to GP and find Aurak, you will be on your own. Some warmer clothing is already on board for you to use when you get there. I just hope Aurak has a plan for you both.
Inga's voice broke as she uttered the last words, and she could feel tears welling up in her eyes once more. Blake listened without comment. They had gone over this before, but she knew that her mother was trying to fill the spaces where an otherwise frightening silence might ensue. The knowledge that these could be the last moments they would ever share hung between them, freezing them both into a trap of small talk, as if speaking their thoughts aloud would somehow bring that terrible possibility into being. The brief ride was over quickly, and Blake and Inga stood in front of the small planet hopper that would take her to Gouda Prime. It had room for a crew of 3, with a small cargo bay, a sleeping area, and a small seating area around a table at the back of the flight deck. All in all, it had little room for anyone to maneuver. The 2 crewmen were already on board, and there wasn't much time before the sun rose, before Blake had to be clear of Exbar, if she was going to be able to escape before any alarm could be raised. Staring at her daughter, Inga smiled and tucked a stray piece of Blake's auburn-tinged hair back into her ponytail.
At no point in your life have I ever known your hair to stay put.
Inga smiled at the memory of a little girl whose wavy hair was always so tangled at the end of the day that no comb could battle its way through it. Blake laughed in spite of her rising anxiety and sadness at the thought of leaving Inga behind. She suddenly hugged her mother, holding her so tightly that for a moment Inga could hardly draw breath. Fighting the urge to beg her daughter to stay, Inga broke free of the embrace first. She reluctantly handed her daughter a blaster and some ammunition packs.
Lou, darling, do you remember what you said to me all those years ago, when you ran away to join the Freedom Fighters?
Blake heard her 21-year-old self shouting recriminations at her mother, so furious at what she perceived as Inga's betrayal of Rog Blake, herself and their family, that she wanted nothing more than to wound Inga emotionally.
Mother, I said things I shouldn't have. I was angry and hurt, and there was a lot I didn't understand.
You said that I couldn't play it safe forever, that I would have to choose a side. And I want you to know I have chosen, as I should have chosen years ago. I choose yours and his side.
The two women stood for a moment, smiling at each other, and with a final hug, Inga turned quickly and walked away. At the buggy, she turned one last time to watch her daughter square her shoulders and walk quickly into the small spaceship that would take her away from X-Bar, possibly forever.
That's right, darling. Don't look back, Blake. Don't ever look back.
After the tension of the last few days, Blake found herself suddenly exhausted and moved quietly into the sleeping area. There were 3 basic beds cut into the grey metal structure of the ship, 2 opposite each other, and one on the back wall next to the door that led to the tiny engineering section. There were no quilts or blankets, just a mattress, a pillow, and a curtain that could be drawn across the sleeping compartment. Her cell on X-Bar had been more comfortable. As she stretched out, Blake listened to the quiet conversation of her fellow crew members. True to Inga's description of them, the 2 men were efficient, and other than the usual niceties and necessary discussions about the ship, they left Blake to herself. The X-Bar-born men were laughing about playing as kids in the chalk escarpments, sliding around and feeling dizzy in the thinner hills air of the desolate planet. Blake smiled to herself, remembering her own childhood adventures in those same hills, and her mother's grim expression as she tried, with little success, to brush the chalk dust out of her daughter's tangled masses of hair, before inevitably giving up and sending Blake to bed. Except Blake wasn't known as Blake then, just Lou, a little girl living with her young mother and grandfather. She couldn't really picture her grandfather, Ashton, very clearly anymore. Hard years spent trying to survive on the former Federation prison planet had worn him down, and he was dead by the time Blake was 3, before he could become a definite figure in her memories. For the little girl running through Blake's memories, there was really only herself and her mother. Inga was always there, and despite being preoccupied with her efforts to make X-Bar a better and more habitable place for its people, she was always ready to stop and ruffle Lou's hair or give her a quick hug. Blake smiled as she remembered heading off on little adventures, happy to be on her own, just as long as she knew Inga was there somewhere, if she ever needed somewhere safe to go. Blake shifted, trying to get comfortable in the cramped bunk. She'd forgotten just how boring and uncomfortable space travel could be. As she lay there, her memories shifted to just before her 5th birthday, around the time her calm, quiet mother seemed to undergo a change. Inga was laughing more, wearing her long brown hair down and spending a few more moments each morning in front of the one mirror in their living quarters. She only saw him once, Blake realized, the Federation soldier with whom her mother had fallen in love. She remembered hearing her mother laughing and, running around the corner of their quarters, Blake had seen her mother smiling at a tall young man in a familiar black uniform. He wasn't wearing the menacing helmet, but Blake knew exactly what he was, and she started to run and pull her mother away. As a little girl, she hadn't been afraid of much, but those black helmets made regular appearances in her bad dreams, and she didn't want her mother anywhere near the tall man. Just as she was about to grab her hand, Blake looked up at her mother's smiling face and shining brown eyes and realized she wasn't afraid and that she actually wanted to talk to the man. She winced, seeing her younger self stop, and for the first time, feeling like her mother was a stranger. Why else would she be laughing with this black, uniformed man? A few weeks later, her mother seemed to change again. She became pale and barely seemed to smile, much less laugh. All too soon she was being sick in the morning and always seemed to be tired. Blake frowned, lying there in the bunk, and realized she couldn't remember the months that followed very well. Her next recollections were of her mother holding something, gesturing for Blake to come over and look at a tiny, red-faced baby that her mother told her was Arlen Joden, her brother, and someone she must always look out for. Smiling now, she remembered how angry her 5-year-old self was with the interloper. They didn't need anyone else, she and her mother. They had been doing just fine before this screaming little creature arrived. By the time she was 8 and Joden was 3, Blake couldn't remember not having a small shadow that tried to copy everything she did and follow her wherever she went. Her smile faded, and Blake found she didn't want to remember the time in which Joden grew up, preferring to lock it away in the corner of her mind where she put all inconvenient thoughts and memories. Against her will, though, she saw flashes of her brother as he got older, spoiled and adored by both his mother and his sister. Blake had never really wondered about her own lack of a father. On Exbar, with its harsh environment and myriad of dangers, many children grew up without knowing their fathers, who were often the first to perish trying to keep their families safe. By the time Joden was 6, Exbar was starting to become a more pleasant place to live, with families willing to move there and start new lives. More and more, Joden saw little boys with fathers and he felt different. Unlike Blake, Joden noticed when others had something he didn't, noticed anything that made him feel like he was somehow missing something. Now the memories were sharper in Blake's mind, more vivid, and she remembered at the age of 20 reading the electronic journals she found filed away in her grandfather's data store, realizing who her family really was, who Rog was, the cousin that made the name of Blake known throughout the galaxy. The pieces had fitted together as she started to understand who she was, and more so what she needed to do, alongside deep-felt anger at her mother for keeping the truth hidden from herself and Joden. Blake shook her head slightly, frowning now as she really didn't want to remember, didn't want to think about the moment when things changed between her brother and herself. Angry at her mother, running to find Joden, shaking him awake, and then showing him the journal and excitedly telling him all she had discovered. Joden's face, confused at first, then becoming angry, yelling at his sister that it was all lies, exclaiming that he wasn't part of a traitor's family and how his father was a brave soldier, loyal to the Federation as he was going to be. More than any other moment, Blake tried to keep this memory at the very back of her mind, where she kept everything that she feared might weaken her resolve. She hated how that memory made her feel like she had no family. Her mother, whom she had trusted more than anyone else, had lied to her, robbed her of her identity for years. Her brother, whom she had protected and defended throughout their childhood, rejected the very thing Blake believed would give their lives meaning and purpose. That deep-seated feeling led her at the age of 21 to flee Exbar, to run away from her brother, away from her mother and the memories of the family she had known all her life, towards the shadowy figure of her cousin Rog Blake and his cause, determined to destroy the Federation that had cast its evil shadow over everything she had once loved. The journey from Exbar to Gouda Prime was uneventful, much to the relief of Blake and her 2 crewmates. The few times she had tried to make conversation, Blake was met with taciturn politeness. Barrick and Caden were true sons of Exbar, dependable and sturdy, and deeply loyal to Inga, but not given to extraneous talk or unnecessary attempts at witty repartee. Clever conversation had never been a requirement for survival on Exbar, as the ability to work hard and keep one's own counsel was. As the ship grew closer to Gouda Prime and its blockade, though, the 2 men became noticeably more agitated, restless in their movements and guarded in their glances at Blake. She nervously reviewed the codes sent to her by Aurak, as the moment the ship would attempt to penetrate the tight circle of security that surrounded the frontier planet neared. Over and over, she played various scenarios out in her mind. What if the codes didn't work? Or if they did, what if her brother had somehow guessed her plans and alerted the authorities in control of Gouda Prime airspace? Not for the first time, Blake felt sharp tendrils of anxiety penetrate the wall of certainty she had established to protect herself from hovering doubts that could paralyze her and make her doubt the righteousness of her mission. It was less fear for herself than the knowledge that she was risking the lives of the 2 loyal men on board that played on her mind. The moment of truth finally arrived, and Barrick spoke up from his position at the flight console.
We're now in Gouda Prime airspace.
The deepening of the frown lines in his normally expressionless face hinted at his unease. That unease deepened as just a few spatials away they witnessed 2 small, rounded ships move quickly and nimbly to shoot down a large freighter ship.
Seems the blockade's reputation for ruthlessness was not over-exaggerated. We didn't pick up any comms, and they didn't even attempt to make contact with that freighter.
The edge in Barrick's normally calm voice betrayed how shaken he was. Caden became more alert, his attention focused on keeping the small ship on the correct course without deviation. Now was not the time for any careless mistakes that would bring the craft into the wrong approach, or draw fire from the trigger-happy guardians of the blockade, even before they could discover the validity of the codes. Blake felt a crushing wave of panic rise within her, watching the remains of the freighter scatter in the surrounding space. She breathed deeply, attempting to remain calm. With a burst of noise, the ship's comms system sprang into life, making them all jump in their seats. Amid the static, a cold, no-nonsense voice filled the cabin.
Identify yourself with your codes, or leave Gouda Prime space.
At least they have opened communications. Fairer treatment than it seems the freighter was afforded.
Blake spoke slowly, trying to keep her breathing steady.
Authorization code is Alpha 6-2 Delta Lima 5 Bravo 8 8 Victor 7.
I repeat, identify yourself with your codes, or leave Gouda Prime space.
What the hell? Why aren't they receiving us?
Barrick frantically scanned the communications panel and randomly pressed buttons, shaking his head as he did so.
Something's wrong with our comm system. We're receiving them, but they don't seem to be hearing us.
Blake grabbed the side of her seat tightly and scanned her mind in vain for a plan B, finding nothing. She knew the situation was horrifyingly simple. Either the codes worked, or they were all dead. Caden, watching the ship's radar screen, turned with terror-filled eyes towards Blake, who didn't need him to explain the significance of the 4 extra dots now apparent on the ship's view screen. The crew had, only moments ago, seen the ruthless efficiency of those gunships that guarded the Gouda Prime airspace.
Authorization code is Alpha 6-2 Delta Lima 5 Bravo 8 8 Victor 7.
For what seemed an eternity, the incoming comms alert blinked with static, but agonizingly remained silent. Blake and the 2 men held their breath, expecting at any moment to see flashes of light emanate from the gunships that completely surrounded their tiny, vulnerable craft, a light that would bring their imminent destruction.
Authorization is granted for you to land in and access Plantation 12 and Plantation 12 only. If you ignore these restrictions, a law enforcement officer may instantly terminate you. Your authorization is for 24 hours only. If your ship is still on Gouda Prime at that point, it will be embargoed. To leave Gouda Prime space, you will need to give your exit codes or your ship will be destroyed. Proceed to Plantation 12 using the coordinates we have sent to your ship's computer.
Blake sat down quickly, not trusting her shaking legs to keep her upright. For the first time since hearing Aurak's message, the harsh reality of what she was doing hit her. She had faced danger before, when she first left X-Bar and joined the Freedom Fighters, but at the age of only 21, Blake had been shielded by the perceived invulnerability of youth, the inability to really believe in her own mortality. Now, all these years later, Blake had tasted abject terror for the first time. Fear, not only for herself, but also for the innocent men who had come so close to losing their lives for a cause that Blake had chosen to champion, not them. As the small ship landed in the designated area, she thought it would be a long time before the sick feeling left her, if indeed it ever would. Blake nodded and smiled towards Caden and Barrick. She zipped up an elegant, hip-length, figure-hugging jacket in a complementing green over her thick blue shirt and grabbed the sidearm her mother had given her. As ever, she scraped her unruly hair back and tied it into a ponytail. A few last-minute checks to make sure her handheld device was functioning, and that her crewmates had the exit codes for leaving Gouda Prime airspace. Then it was time for her to disembark. She considered giving Barrick and Caden a hug in gratitude for their help, but their anxious faces made her realize that the only thanks they required was her departure so they could leave the planet safely. Squaring her shoulders, Blake descended the steps from the ship onto the field and watched as her last link with her home took off, leaving her feeling more alone than she had ever felt before.